Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. We are very excited to talk about impactful redlining, some of the do's and don'ts of the negotiation stage. I'm really excited about this topic because for transactional attorneys, this is really how we communicate. This is our courtroom, how we present ourselves and our organization. So we can kick off with some introductions. My name is Samantha Nickerson. I'm going to be the host of today's course. I'm currently a solutions engineer and a licensed attorney with LinkSquares, and I'm joined by two of my incredible colleagues, Jonathan Greenblatt and Ashlyn Donahue. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, say a fun fact, and just one of their redlining pet peeves.
Thanks so much, Sam. So I'm not sure of a fun fact, but I have a joke. It was on the whiteboard as I came in, and I thought it was a little funny. Might take a second to sink in, but it says, so I told a joke on a Zoom meeting and nobody laughed. Turns out I'm not remotely funny. All right, just let it sink in. And I would say one redlining pet peeve is when folks do not accept, when they've accepted the comments and they send it back to us, they put a comment bubble, but they don't actually sort of accept the deletion or the insertion, and it's confusing to see whether or not it's actually accepted or not on their side.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Love the joke. My name's Ashlyn Donahue. I'm the director of legal here at LinkSquares. I have been here for about 9 months. For fun fact, I guess I will go with I once went to snowboard camp with Sean White a long time ago. So pet peeve for redlining for me would be getting comments back in PDF form where you can't actually edit the document and it's just like strike throughs and red text in a PDF, and then you have to kind of manually move those over to a Word document.
Great. Yeah. I guess I'll answer my own question too. I have been with LinkSquares for about a year and a half. Fun fact about me is that my husband and I are getting a lab puppy this weekend. So can hardly contain myself. Very excited. And I would say my redlining pet peeve is when the counterparty just attaches a schedule with conflicting terms, kind of duplicative efforts and some things that we're going to talk about. So setting an agenda for our session today, we're going to cover some important considerations in learning to redline, along with some problematic practices, and even step outside of the scope of redlining and talk through a few tips and tricks. Before we get into kind of the meat and potatoes, I kind of want to start out talking about simply that process of learning to redline and really how Jonathan and Ashlyn, both of you started out your careers. If either of you want to give some context into early experience, mentors, and really how you began your careers in redlining.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, Sam. I'm happy to start. I started straight out of law school. I went in-house, and I remember my first day of in-house practice where my boss sat me down and just explained how 90% of what we do is work with track changes as in-house attorneys, and essentially started teaching me a little bit of the skills and the art of how to do it. But when we started talking about this content, and why I think this content is actually very powerful is because as I progressed in my career, I matured in how I redlined. And there was definitely an inflection point when I started working more and more with enterprise customers. And what I realized was the way I was actually doing things was actually slowing down our deals and causing frustration. At the time, I didn't actually recognize that it was what I was doing. I just assumed it was the other side being unreasonable. But my boss sat me down and she said, Jonathan, there's a better way to do what you're doing and to get the same results. Let's walk through it. And that conversation really stayed with me. And she remembered from that point onward, the deals were just going so much smoother. So really happy to share those secrets that she taught me, and also some other things that I've picked up along the way.
Yeah, so I'll share that I got the bug to redline contracts as a co-op student. I went to Northeastern and we would go and do internships throughout the year. And I actually was learning to redline with a red pen on printed paper just to start to get the concepts of like, what do you care about? And we would sit down and talk about it live. And from there, just really progressed and kind of focused on going into a position that would allow me to redline contracts. And similar to Jonathan, I think, a few years into my practice, I had a very pivotal conversation where my manager at the time sat me down and talked about really the intent behind how you're communicating to your counterparty through your red lines and your comments and the impact that it can have, whether or not it's like the same end concept being shared. How you frame that, how you relay that is going to make the world of difference between bringing someone else to the table or kind of frustrating them, to be honest. And so really changed how I approached not only the way that I redlined an agreement, but also the way that I inserted comments and the tone within those comments.
Yeah, no, that's great feedback. And I think a lot of how we'll run the session and the discussion today focuses in on that representation of self and of organization. How can we best communicate and best partner with those that we work with? And with that we can kick off. So, with the idea of redlining, there's a functional approach to beginning that negotiation. Ashlyn, how about you kind of take us from the top about how you approach negotiations and where you really begin with the idea of redlining?
Yeah. So for me, I start by seeking to understand what the deal objectives are from the business perspective. Is this a sales side contract? Is it a vendor contract? You know, all of the nitty gritties that go into that. Is it, from a vendor side, what's the deal size? Who are we contracting with? What are the risks associated? Are we sharing any data with them? And some of the same questions on the sales front as well, really to inform my understanding of the potential risks associated with the agreement and kind of if it's a sales side contract, like what our positioning may be based on the relationship that we have and the deal transaction that is going to go through. And from there, I really just start to take a look at like what is in the set of terms. If we have standard internal positions on certain items, making sure that it aligns to those. But then really going and digging deeper. Is there something that maybe conceptually is close, but not quite there? Like, how can I work with the language that's being presented and proposed, but still make sure that I'm meeting our internal practices and stance on certain areas?
Yeah, that's great. I think in this discussion, what we're going to do is kind of talk about in that beginning process. Do you begin with jumping right into that agreement, printing it out, and pull out the red pen like the old days? Or is there a different way that you approach that today?
I say it depends, right? Like for an event contract or something lower risk or something that after going through a quick scan feels like it's pretty closely aligned and there may be one or two things that I would like to request a change on, I might send an issues list back to the counterparty rather than a red line. It makes it in those instances potentially easier for them to see what the requested changes are, particularly if they're ones that could possibly done on an order form rather than in the set agreement. So it's really dependent on the scenario for me. I don't know, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And it's fun working here at LinkSquares because we work a lot with general counsels who are buying products for themselves, and we get issues lists when every so often for when they're buying our products. And you can tell it's just a very quick way for someone to communicate that, hey, like most this is generally fine. Your terms are very fair, but hey, I need these one or two points. And sometimes it really does make everything go faster for everybody. And I think part of this process is how do we sort of get to that end result faster, because that's ultimately what our business wants. And so how do we get to that result faster? So sometimes there is a place for an issues list. There's also a time and place, to be honest, if it's one or two changes where you just take the other side's contract, you just make the change to the contract, you send it back signed, and you just say, hey, we made these two changes. Like, I think it's very important from an ethics perspective to always highlight those changes. But that's why you always got to be very careful though, because the other sides, might not have the exact same viewpoint. You always want to sort of run compares and compare your documents, but there is a time and place for issues list, or even just literally just making the changes if it's just one or two changes and they're pretty reasonable, and just sending it back to the other side and letting them know what you did.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next slide is a one that I like to call a tale of two red lines. Obviously, there are some differences between these two documents. So, Jonathan, I'd love to have you kind of take us through what you see when you look at the agreement to the left versus the one to the right.
Yeah, I see myself having negotiated the deal on the left, in my first like 1 to 5 years of practice, and I see the document on the right as myself having negotiated that deal, later on in my career, where I started thinking a lot more strategically about how to approach the other side's language. So, when you're redlining, the area where you need to be very sensitive is when you have deals, particularly on the sales side, where you're working off the other side's paper. You always it's typically faster for us as LinkSquares to negotiate off of our paper, and for most companies, it's always faster to negotiate off of your own paper, particularly when your paper is specific to the product or service being delivered versus another side's paper that might be very general. That said, there are going to be times where you need to make exceptions, and in those exceptions, if you've made that exception, it's probably because the deal is pretty important and pretty high profile, and so you want to come in and you want to look like that collaborative partner. The image on the left has a lot more red, and that's going to raise the cackles of maybe the lawyer on the other side, or the contracts manager, whatever legal professional is actually reviewing the contract. More than likely, though, it's actually going to raise the cackles of the business partner on the other side, who's going to say, "Oh my God, your legal's so unreasonable." And you really want to try to avoid that someone making that pitch back to your side, because that creates just a lot of tension and bottleneck. So by being a little bit more strategic, you can get to the document on the right and pretty much come out with the exact same terms. And I think we'll sort of walk through how we actually get there. So Ashlyn, do you see anything between these two documents?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, um, there has been instances in my career when I have approached much more from like, I know what my approved language is and I'm sticking to it because I'm not maybe comfortable yet going outside of the lines of what I know I can agree to growing into a place where I am conceptually aligned with what our positions are internally. And I know how to work with the terms that are presented to me and get to a place that lands us where we need to be and we're comfortable without just ripping and replacing entire sections. And also providing that context. I think one thing that really stands out to me between these two is comments, right? Like you're providing some context as to why certain things are being removed rather than just removing them with no explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then this reminds me of something we've discussed, Jonathan, which is that idea that your red lines and the document that you send back is your representation. This is how we communicate with the opposing counsel, how we present ourselves, how that document looks, the colors to it, the comments, and the white space is something that is a representation of the stance we've taken in the negotiation. Kind of that idea that the white space is key. I speak a little bit more, either one of you, kind of about how that leads into that partnership that we're presenting.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is, as you mentioned, Sam, this is how folks are communicating with each other. And when your team or you as the lawyer send that document over to the other side, the first thing their business person is going to look at is at the white space. It's if they see a ton of red, it's going to get people very excited, particularly if they are buying something, because who he or she who has the purse strings has the power is a very often used phrase. And there's still going to be negotiation, and just because somebody's buying something doesn't mean they're going to necessarily get the terms they want. But if they see a lot of white space, it makes them feel like there's momentum, that, okay, cool, we're going to get this over the line. If they see that all of that red, they're thinking to themselves is how much effort is it going to take? How long am I going to have to wait for this contract to get negotiated to get what I want? And are there alternatives? Because I just don't want to wait 3 or 4 months for a contract to get negotiated. I think the sort of having all of that white space it telegraphs to that other side that like, hey, we're going to move through this quickly.
Just to add to that, I think it absolutely does telegraph to the other side, but it also telegraphs internally too. I think that when we send something back to our internal business stakeholders, whether they're buying something or selling something, they're excited about the prospect of closing a deal and moving forward. And when they pull it up and they see the version on the left, they think, "Oh man, like this is going to take us quite a bit of time." And they might come back with some questions like, "Hey, can you help me understand? Like, why are we taking this? Why can't we agree to some of this language?" Whereas on the right, it seems much more reasonable. Like we're trying to partner, we're helping them be a partner in closing their deal. And I think that just fosters a better internal relationship and some trust with your internal stakeholders as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point, Ashlyn, just about being an educator for the business and for members of sales or other departments that you're working with in order to achieve that objective that benefits the org and that um, teaches the other departments about some of the things that you're concerned with in legal, protecting the organization objectives that we need to meet internally, but also being a partner as we work for new business and signing on um, new customers in that sales side use case. Ashlyn, the idea of comments, I know we've discussed that a little bit. Is there any kind of advice that you'd like to give about comments inline versus copy and pasting text kind of directly into the agreement?
Yeah. And so when I add comments, I really try to explain like, we have made this change because of X. And then if it warrants it, we I add additional context, like for some context. If there's something unique about the product that we're selling that is around our business and the way that we operationally support our customer base, like I provide that additional context and commentary so that it is abundantly clear, like why I've taken this position. And, if it's something that we have flexibility on, we can discuss and it's something that we can continue to understand their concerns better. I ask them like, hey, if you have more concerns or something specific you want to rate, please let me know. Happy to review. So it's about a discussion. It's a partnership. That's what really the whole art of negotiation really is getting to. And comments are going to allow you to do that asynchronously rather than having to get on the phone every single time. That's not to say that there are not times where you should get on the phone. I know we'll get to that, but the comments are really going to help, facilitate those conversations in a more efficient manner by honing in on what really is still outstanding. If you can get through those prior comments.
Yeah. And I would say that like I sort of think about comments um as being particularly impactful as you're moving further into the negotiation. Oftentimes the first drafts from each side are kind of like, here's my position, I'm going to ask for everything. The other side's going to get it and say like, okay, I see you're asking for everything. I can't agree to that. And maybe we'll try to get to sort of more of a middle, but like, this is kind of like where sort of like, these are my boundaries here. From that point onward, then you can really start to flesh out what are people really, really caring about in this deal. And I think at that point, it becomes particularly impactful to add those comments. I'd also add once you're getting closer to a deadline. So for a lot of technology companies, it's a end of a quarter deadline. You at that point probably want to be you want to over comment rather than under comment because you do want them to understand sort of what your positions are and you have a lot less time to get that deal done.
Yeah,
Really?
absolutely.
So,
Anything else to add with the idea kind of copying and pasting and how you've seen that play out either poorly or be just simply what's necessary for some negotiations?
yeah, I'd love to jump in there because I think that's part of maturation as an attorney. You are so wed to your standard language as a junior attorney that I think creates, or somebody who's newer to negotiating contracts or earlier in their career, and it becomes very easy to just copy and paste large chunks and put it in. I'd also say people who are newer to an organization, even if you have a ton of experience, you're not sure of your boundaries. And we'll talk about ways um, to solve that problem later on down. But when you're not sure of your boundaries, you want to like hold tightly to your contract language. And being a very good and flexible business attorney requires you to step away from your own standard language and really focus on the concepts you're trying to get across.
Yeah, just to add to that, something that I see happen frequently with copying and pasting is like you don't invest the time to make the changes to mirror the defined terms in the contract that you're reviewing. So if you defined, let's just pick on the confidential information section, it as recipient versus receiving party, and you receive red lines that are all receiving party, it just adds another cycle, even if we can conceptually agree, but the terminology doesn't play out accurately. You're adding some time to your deal negotiation. It's not moving it forward as quickly as it could because there are those that just to make it work within the contractual language that is presented throughout the rest of the document or clause.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ashley, because I think we also holds close very tightly to the terminology that's in our standard templates. And oftentimes it's going to be, you can be very creative with somebody else's document. If somebody has the word statement of work and you want to reference an order form, there's a way to, if the whole document is using statement of work, it becomes very clunky to have red lines everywhere that redlining out statement of work to replace it with order form. Um, while that might be the more accurate um, document that you'll be working off of, an order form document, perhaps you change the definition of statement of work to include the order form, so you're not having to make the change throughout the entire document. If you do feel that it's absolutely necessary to make a terminology change like that through the document, perhaps another technique to preserve the white space is to just go ahead and make the change of statement of work to order form. Maybe you communicate that outside of the contract, um, but you can also go in and just put a comment saying, "I've made a global change to this term, given that we're going to work off of an order form as statement of work." Again, I would caution you to probably communicate that to the other side before making that change. But just a change in one word can truly change the optics of the actual document if that word is used throughout the document.
Now you have to be careful, right? Because if you miss one, and then all of a sudden you've got this defined term of statement of work, everyone's like, well, what is that? Right. And so a year from now, 2 years from now, someone else picks it up to review it. Are they going to understand that that was a global change that was made across in this one? The intent was to have it transition over to be defined as order form. So just really being thoughtful about, when you're making updates, like reading through the entirety of the contract and catching all of those defined terms when copying and pasting and pulling them through.
Definitely. And just providing that context, like a quick blurb about why we're inserting this language, why we're taking this position, and maybe substituting out what is the other party's standard language, and why this is how we meet in the middle and reach that agreement and compromise there. Ashlyn, I know we talked about a funny story about context, and I don't know if you want to share and add a little color here about how things can be a little confusing when that context is omitted.
Yeah. And so, I once had a contract and I think it was a typing error on the other side, which essentially said we could bring any type of giraffe, elephant, or tiger to a space, but no service area animals. And so I think that when you're making changes, and this is just one to highlight for folks, is like sometimes, you make changes that like conceptually just don't make sense to the other side. And this is kind of in the extreme. Like I understood what the intent was behind that. It was probably a typing error, but there are times on the other side won't. And so providing that context to why you're making the change. I mean, if this truly was the intent, like I would want to know, why is it that we can bring giraffes but not service animals to this venue? So provide a comment, add some information around that. Otherwise, sometimes your positioning gets lost in the shuffle.
Definitely. Yeah, this little story leaves me with with some questions and also kind of makes me just, of course, chuckle. I love this picture. And there's probably some times that everyone listening and of course the three of us have experienced where you have to step outside of the agreement and think in some universe this is hilarious, this back and with the idea kind of um just communicating effectively and communication in general. We've talked about how comments really can be your friend, your fair weather friend, in the negotiation, provide that clarity and allow you to posture to the other side and in the right way rather than, again, just by crossing out text and going within the agreement itself. Um, the idea of weaving in red lines versus keeping comments kind of outside and in their own bubbles is, I think, something that adds a lot of value and that plays a part in the maturation of the lawyer that's doing that negotiation.
Yeah. And one other thing is there's actually a tremendous optical value of putting red lines when you do make a lot of changes. So if you look at the document on the right, those the way that it darkens the deletion softens that deletion. It makes it less harsh, and I think that actually promotes the concept of, hey, we're moving forward. And the fact that you have insertions rather than deletions is very powerful. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later, but insertions show, hey, we're moving forward. It helps promote the white space. Deletions look like you're trying to essentially not agree with the other side. They're disagreeable and they just visually look disagreeable. So when you do have particularly deletions, it's very powerful to copy over that with a comment bubble. So, but the one thing I would caution is you can over comment. Like I mentioned, like when you're doing your first passes, oftentimes each side is just feeling the other side out, and there are certain times when you're working with another side, you kind of know exactly what they're asking for. You know what you think is fair. Maybe you put a comment, maybe you don't, because you can have too many comments. So you do just want to be mindful as to having too many comments when the situation doesn't necessarily necessitate it.
Hmm. Do you find that you comment more with each new draft? I know sometimes you're going back and forth dozens and dozens of times. Do you find comments being more effective toward the end of the negotiation or not so, more so throughout?
No, I would say definitely it's context dependent, but definitely like that sort of middle to end. It's commenting is really sort of establishing the logic behind the changes, and that's going to help the other side understand what your position is, and also what is the sort of the intent behind what you're trying to accomplish. Because sometimes both parties are aligned with the intent and are fine with the sort of interests. It's just the actual wording that causes heartburn.
I would say, from my own personal perspective, I think I approach how and when I comment a little bit differently when I'm reviewing contract for the revenue organization on the sales side versus when I'm reviewing from the, procurement buy side. And part of that, I think, is that there's operational considerations when you're talking about selling your own products, more so than when you're buying something for most instances. So there's often opportunity earlier on in the process to provide that context on the sales side. Whereas to Jonathan's point, like on the vendor side, I don't necessarily know what the impacts of my changes might be from an operational perspective all of the time, but here's kind of what works for me. So I do find myself differently commenting depending on the reason for the contract review.
Definitely. And a lot of this discussion has surrounded comments that are external, but there's also the idea, and in your experience on a larger legal team, the idea of internal comments and partnering with other stakeholders and individuals who need to approve certain sections within the agreement. So there's that idea as well, in terms of that internal review process.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
oftentimes you will have to circulate the draft to internal folks. So being able to help orient your internal stakeholders to what the issues are, because they don't want to sit there and read this whole contract. Like, and I've definitely seen folks who just, send a contract over and they say either like, please review this contract if you have any concerns, business partner and IT, or some other area of the business, or they'll say, please see section 2. Do you approve? And sometimes section 2 is very clear what the issue is, but sometimes section 2 isn't, and it's helpful to orient the business stakeholder and partner as to what the issue is that you need their feedback on.
Yeah, I would say two thoughts on internal comments. One, if I'm doing them in the document itself, I like to highlight them so that before I send it out to the counterparty, I can see, ooh, there's like this text with green highlights on the side. That means it was meant for the internal folks to take a look at. That way, I'm not accidentally sending over our internal commentary to the other party. We've all been on the receiving end of that. And so, really try to be thoughtful. And that's one way that has helped me make sure that those get deleted before being shared out. It also puts the internal folks on notice, like, hey, this is exactly what I want you to look at. Cause I can just say, check out the green section. Or if I want to send it to multiple teams, I might say, hey, security, look at green, finance, look at yellow, right? And so it really easily draws their eyes. Internally, I know we talked a little bit about issue list as well. That this is an area where for internal comments and input, is, an issues list is sometimes a great way to go about it. You can say, hey, in section 2, it's asking us to do X, Y, or Z. Here's why this matters to you. And I'd like your input and feedback on it. And then they can always go in and pop in and look at it. But conceptually, they have the information up front and they understand why you're asking in a quick bulleted list prior to even going into the document.
And
Definitely. Oh, go ahead.
Sam, I was gonna say like one more thing I think about comments that's really good to note. Going back to when you're dealing with the other side or potentially even internally, and you start building up a long comment chain on the same subject, it starts to become difficult to see where you're at. Um, so so oftentimes what I will do is if we've been going back and forth and it's unclear as to sort of where the comment is on this draft, I will actually put a date on the comment, say 9/26, with a highlight. And I think that helps orient folks as to, okay, this is the comment that I need to, that is sort of responsive here. And that helps the other side or your internal stakeholders know what they should be looking at as sort of the next action item, because those comment bubbles and chains can fill up. It's not demonstrated on the screen here, but I've seen 7 or 8 layers deep and you don't remember what the issue is and what you're going back and forth on. So I find that to be a very helpful way to, again, communicate efficiently to either your external folks or your internal folks.
Yeah, that's also where I like to start highlighting things as well.
Yeah.
If we have multiple sections and maybe one of them is pending the other side and they're still reviewing, but we're going back and forth on other areas of the contract, I might start highlighting the comments on those so that they can easily see, okay, here's where I've made changes. So they're drawn to that. And the rest, they know that, I haven't touched it. They don't have to take a look at that. It just helps them go through quicker.
Yeah, definitely. And this is something I think we'll talk about later on in the session. But the idea of your own SLAs and your efficiency internally, what is my turnaround time? How am I being the best partner that I can be to the business? And I think there's just an aspect of, um, again, maturation as an attorney where you learn this is the most efficient way that I can communicate with my team, with the opposing attorneys and organization that I'm working with, because I'm sure it's been quite a long time that you all have been working on, since you've been working on just one or two red lines at a time. You're juggling dozens of negotiations at once. So the way that we can build in that efficiency and um, clear, direct, purpose communication is just going to make everyone's lives easier as you continue on in that. I saw a question come through in the channel just about how we can appear reasonable. The question says, how can I show all of the different changes that I made with that trail of support and comments without being perceived as unreasonable or unfair. So good question, and would love to pose that back to you, Ashlyn and Jonathan.
One thing I do sometimes, if there are quite a few changes that throughout the contract, is right at the very top. I just add a comment bubble, and I kind of set the stage, and I say like, "Hey, thanks for your comments and edit. We've aimed to be flexible where we could, but you'll see throughout we've made some edits and modifications. We're happy to hop on a call to discuss." So before they even see the red text or changes below, at the top, which is generally a very white area, they know that there are going to be edits, that I am open to partnering with them. I want to get on a call and discuss with them if they have concerns or questions. So as they're going through that in the back of their mind, and they know that that door is already there and the partnership mentality is already up at the forefront.
Right.
Yeah, I think also feel free to use your own voice in commenting back. Always have to be professional, but I find that it takes a little bit of the heat out of the room if you can just feel like you're putting your authentic voice out there in your comments respectfully. You know what? I've even thrown in a joke or two from time to time, like put it towards the end. It's a little Easter egg for them to find. And you know what? I find that's gone over very well. Now you always have to be thoughtful about how you do it. If things are very tense, maybe that's not what you want to do. But if you're going through and particularly as you're sort of wrapping it up, or even maybe as a starting point, talking about venue, all of us have sort of restrictions on where we typically would want to have venue agreed to in a contract, but you can make a side comment about Miami being the the choice of venue and why you can't agree to it, while even though that you love going to South Beach. So I think it
Right.
doesn't hurt to do things like that. Again, be thoughtful about how you do it, because it can backfire. But a lot of times, I think that putting your own authentic voice does actually help the negotiation along.
I totally agree. And I think part of that is using your authentic voice naturally softens the way you're communicating back. And one of the things that I do is I go through and I comment everything, but I read them one more time before I send it out. And if I feel like I need to soften anything around the edges so it comes off as more reasonable, or isn't so direct, I make those changes. And I think that's because sometimes you're moving quickly, particularly when you have a lot of deals on your plate, and you might just state your position. And when you don't bring your voice into that, it might not be as like soft around the edges is what I'll say, as it could be and reasonable. And to Jonathan's point about jokes, like maybe there's way to add some of your own voice and context and light in it rather than just no, like because.
Yeah. Though there is always a time and place for the no's. Just you
Yes.
have to be very thoughtful about when you decide to take that approach, because that can backfire quickly.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to be upfront and say, like, this is an area where we have limited flexibility or no flexibility, but give the why. And say, like, if there's a specific thing that you're really concerned about, let's talk about it. So it's not like no, I'm shutting the door forever, but in a way that brings them to the table.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this, that there's an idea of the art of negotiation, the art of knowing what to do and when to do it. So I added this little lovely graphic in here with our own Jonathan Greenblatt, just in that creativity required in working with another party and in the needs of an organization. So I'll let Ashlyn talk through this slide, just because I know that we discussed it beforehand. The idea of accepting what's proposed. Can we work with this? Does it need modification? And how can we flex that creativity here?
Yeah, so probably won't spend a ton of time on this because I think we've covered this already a little bit in our conversation. But it's really about, rather than focusing on the standard language that maybe you're most comfortable with, the concepts behind what that language is intended to um, convey, and really focusing on working with the red lines that you've received or the contract language that you're reviewing and trying to weave in the concepts that matter to you and make sure that what's in there aligns with those rather than just deleting and replacing. And so I think that just sometimes comes with a little bit more practice and something that I have definitely learned to grow into throughout my career. But to the extent that you can kind of focus in on that conceptual reasoning, I think it really helps allow you to be adaptable to what you're reviewing.
Absolutely. Um, Perfect. So we've talked through some different problematic redlining practices, from the idea of using white space effectively, using comments effectively, and just providing that context. Um, from this, and with that, we're going to move into kind of that next section of the discussion, which is the idea of stepping outside the red lines, and how we can and move beyond what's the words on the page, and again, that idea of how we are representing ourselves here. All right, so next piece here, and what we're going to kind of talk through as we wrap up today, is the idea of stepping outside the red lines, these words on the page, and learning about how to communicate more proactively.
Sure. Yeah. I think, as you're doing redlining and there's the back and forth there, there's um there's many other things that are going on that are going to help your negotiation and help keep your sanity as an in-house lawyer who's working with a lot of contracts. And so here we talk about two of them, and I think both are very important. And so proactively communicating turnaround times. Now, I know SLAs. For those that don't know, they're essentially service levels that it's part of the organization might be offering to its clients. So the IT department might offer it, and the legal department might offer it. But what is the expected turnaround time of when you've submitted something to me for me to sort of have that reviewed and done? Um, if you don't have a shop with SLAs, what you can do is you can definitely, I think it's very important, is when something is received to give some folks an expectations of when they should get it back. I know when I'm put on hold, if I'm on hold for 45 minutes and I don't know I'm going to be on hold for 45 minutes, I am furious. If I'm on hold for 45 minutes and at least they told me up front, I'm furious, but I'm slightly less furious. And so to really work well with everyone, I think it's good to have an expectation on the turnaround times. I do think there really is a place for service level um, surface level commitments by the legal organization to other parts of the organization, like the sales team, where they have a default expectation on when work is going to be done. And then, obviously there's exceptions from time to time, but trying to stay within that sort of return window. Um, I also think providing visibility into status is really important. So giving folks a status update. It's also really helpful to know, for folks to know, your business partners to know, even if you've sent something, it's good to have a tracking ability to let them know that it is with the other side, because they're juggling a ton of things and sometimes they'll forget who has the next action item. So I think it's really important to try to provide visibility to your internal folks about where's the next action item. Is it with us or is it with them? Those are the two primary ones. And I think, technology can actually help that. I know our tool does give you a status update. So if it's with the other side, everybody knows it's with the other side, and you can avoid those questions about what's the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a mentor and a supervising attorney earlier in my career that gave me a piece of advice that translates beyond red lines, but it was the idea of being sure to under promise and over deliver rather than the opposite. So I think there is that idea of setting expectations, be it on a larger legal team or when you're working on a small legal team. And that actually is a question that just came in the discussion here. How can we better set those expectations, especially when you are on a small legal team? And especially for the two of you, people know that you're good and they just expect that you can do it all. How do you guys set those expectations?
So I think that we have some upfront expectations that we've agreed to with our business partners here, although SLAs can show up in different forms at different companies. whether it's like actually turning around the document, whether it's sending a response and setting the expectation of when you'll get that. I think that as a small legal team, it's really important to be thoughtful about what your historical ability to turn around contracts has been and kind of using that as a guiding point for setting expectations around when you'll be able to turn around the request that you've just received. We all know, particularly on smaller legal teams, sometimes priorities shift and they shift quickly. And you might not be able to hit that original time because of something that came through the door that just needs to be prioritized. And so that's where I think providing that transparency and communicating that to the business team that might be impacted early and working with them on an agreed path forward is really important. So I think that turnaround times, well, as much as possible, you should absolutely stick to that. There are extenuating circumstances that come in, and it's really again about that transparency.
Definitely. And some of those extenuating circumstances sometimes are end of quarter, which is rapidly approaching. So I know that there's that issue that comes up within our organization and lots of others that are operating on that quarterly time frame. Uh, how about just the idea of even hopping on a call? When and how do you make that decision if there are those internal and external concerns?
I think it's typically great to get on a call after each side is sent their position back and forth. And if there's a lot of changes, if there's a delta between where you guys are at, just get on a call. It's much more efficient. There are times where it's probably a little bit too premature to get on a call. Oftentimes, the business will want us to get on a call before we've even seen what the other side's red lines are. And I think it's helpful to understand their position first before getting on that call, because otherwise you're really shooting from the hip in terms of trying to understand why they made the changes that they are making. And it's forcing you to react quickly. And if you had a little more time to think, you could be a little bit more thoughtful about how you approached their comments.
I do think there are some times where it's important to get on a call before you've even reviewed red lines. And that's when maybe you just need to conceptually align on maybe what paper you're even going to use. Like, let's just start there, right? There are instances where maybe you as an organization have a template that you prefer to use, and maybe the other side does as well. And so getting on calls early in those scenarios and providing some context as to your positioning on that and agreeing before you walk away as to like what paper you're going to even be, reviewed is helpful. And I think just create some rapport throughout the process. On this call, that sometimes also opens the door to provide some context onto like what's going to be really important to you throughout the negotiation process. So if there's areas where you have a little more flexibility to accept their paper and maybe some sections or review certain language that they have as part of that initial, have that conversation. And it just creates a partnership mentality going right into the negotiation process.
Those are excellent points, Ashlyn.
Absolutely. And kind of right in line with that idea of assessing the risks and having the knowledge of when a call is best versus not. Either of you feel free to talk more about that risk analysis and also working within your playbook.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that, and Jonathan's heard me say this before, like I had a colleague, a good friend of mine once tell me when I reviewed one of my very first event contracts, like, can't review every event contract as if you're like giving all of your customers' data away, right? It's an hour-long event. It's low risk. Like you need to take the risk into account. And I think that totally shifted the way that I approach contracting. And it all goes into like, what is the engagement for and what is the purpose? As a newer attorney or someone who's newer to commercial transactions, sometimes understanding your business's risk tolerance or how best to assess risk within a contract can be difficult. So one of the things that I've done with my team in the past is really providing them a framework around how I think about risk, working with my leadership team on the legal side to understand like what's most important to them, to help them feel empowered to maybe go outside of the lines a little bit, outside of the playbook language, as long as they understand the risks and the concepts that matter most to us. And that's where I think documenting, creating playbooks around that, and including your risk tolerance positioning can really be an impactful thing, and help create consistency across your organization so that folks are approaching negotiations in a similar manner. And we don't have a scenario where one person is maybe over redlining a low risk contract, and another is maybe not redlining it enough, right? And so it creates that balance and consistency in approach.
Yeah. And I think that one thing for folks who are in that leadership role or who are moving towards that leadership path in a legal department, it's don't forget to take the time to create those playbooks and that guidance to empower your team. Because it's very easy to get caught up in the day to day. And if you're not sending that message to the team of what those risk tolerances are, then yeah, I think you're doing a bit of a disservice to the team because folks are going to try to negotiate how they think leadership wants them to negotiate, and that can oftentimes be wrong, and oftentimes it's very conservative. They folks do not feel empowered to take risks that leadership would otherwise actually want them to take, based on the true risk at hand. So I think that's just an important thought for folks who are in legal leadership.
Absolutely. And it goes towards your brand as the attorney and again, stepping outside of that redlining stance. This is more so a summary slide, but there is a point on here that I think is a one to note, which is the help and assistance of technology in moving through red lines faster and working with your team in a more efficient way.
Yeah, we've seen some of the improvements in tools in our own tool of how you can actually do the redlining process faster. Whether that's having your clause library in Word off to the side so you can easily take language and put it in, whether that's being able to highlight text and communicate to folks in Word and not having to sort of send emails or Slack messages out of Word, but being able to actually do it within Word. That's all just making the redlining process faster. There are interesting auto redlining technologies out there. We've used some. There oftentimes can be a great starting point, but there's definitely needs to be maturation to take it through the entire contract lifecycle from what we've seen or the negotiation lifecycle. But they can often be very, very good starting points.
One thing I also really love about technology is the ability to communicate with your business partners where you're working. And so I personally prefer to draft in Word. And so historically, sometimes that has meant like taking notes on the side and then copying and pasting them. One of the things that has really helped me most effectively negotiate and communicate with my business partners real time is like being able to have that activity log and that technology sitting within where I want to work, and provide me with the ability to real time send messages rather than clicking out and context switching to somewhere else, which I think has made a significant impact on my efficiency.
There's some additional resources that we're going to share with everyone that's tuned in, but wanted to save the last few minutes. One to thank those who've participated and also to talk through some Q&A. There are some questions that have come through the chat that I think are ones worth discussing. And one of those is what are the pros and cons of redlining in the body of the contract versus just adding an addendum that lists out your changes?
So I think the addendum can actually be very impactful if there's just a few changes. The big risk there is, are you creating conflicting terms? And I've seen really good experienced lawyers do great addendums that really don't conflict and allows the business deal to move forward. The other risk that you need to take into account is just making sure that when you have to review that contract for, once it's signed, if you ever have to go back to it, that you know that there are substantive terms in an addendum.
Yeah, I think there's also occasionally a time and place where it might be appropriate to even make one or two changes on your order form. But I think you have to be careful with that, particularly if you're making quite substantive changes at the order form level and doing it kind of progressively as the relationship goes. How many documents are you how many times are you amending the same term on a different set of paper, and be really thoughtful about ensuring that you can follow that path. And that's where maybe an addendum, rather than just one-offs on an order form could help as well.
Absolutely. All right. I think we have time for one more question. So I'll read it now. I've seen situations where vendors are sticking to standard terms or hyperlinked terms with no opportunity to negotiate, will only allow red lines for spend over a certain threshold. Have you experienced this? If so, how do you deal with it? Or just any general comment on the matter?
Yeah,
This
have experience. Yeah, I was gonna say, definitely experience it, and I think goes to assessing the risk. Um, oftentimes you can make changes on the order form, and that actually move the ball. But if if it's a very substantive contract important to your business and you need to negotiate, you got to work with your business partners about how you're going to communicate that. You got to explain the risk to them. And we found that in doing that, our business team, when they're buying things, will be very thoughtful and typically does understand the importance of what we're asking for and has moved away from vendors. And oftentimes, if you tell a vendor you're moving away from them, all of a sudden that threshold that they say they need to negotiate drops dramatically. Sometimes it doesn't. And so this is just, you know, being thoughtful about the risk and working with your business team.
Yeah, I think back to the discussion we had earlier on issues versus um, red lines. If we know that I know a vendor is not going to negotiate at all and they want us to sign on the hyperlinked terms, but there is one or two really important things. That's where like an issues work is going to go a long way rather than editing the contract and sending a red line, which they don't want to review. It's an easy thing for them to convey internally on their side, and really get to the context and points across rather than asking them to flip through pages and find those two edits that I've made.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I know we could talk about this subject for hours and hours, but our hour has expired. So thank you to those who joined today. And we hope this has been helpful. And again, thanks for tuning in with us.